Alright everybody, so next up in our statistics course we're going to talk about different types of studies, and there's two basic types just to start with, and those fall into either observational where we're either looking at or gathering data, that is pre-existing. In other words, I'm not trying to change anything. I'm not trying to cause an effect or anything like that. So a really great example of that is our example of favorite colors. We're not changing anybody's favorite colors, right? We're just trying to figure out what they're doing. Their favorite restaurant. If you went to the Lowe's store and they surveyed you about what your experience was, they're not necessarily trying to change you or get you to buy anything at that moment. They're just trying to find out what you were doing in there. So they're gathering data, they're observing you. Okay, so that's observational. And then the second type is experimental. And on experimental, we are trying to change something. So we're trying to influence an outcome. Okay, if we can. So a really great example of this would be that study that I mentioned about the polio vaccination, right? What were they trying to do? They were trying to make sure that kids wouldn't have polio. So we go in and we give you a treatment and hopefully you don't have polio, right? So another idea would be the example where I talked about antidepressant medicines, especially if we're trying to target a particular group, like what I mentioned. I think I said dealing with young people with antidepressant medicines. And then another one, so I'm trying to get away from medical, because medical is definitely, when we see medical stuff, they're experimenting for sure. But another one might be like if I was trying to fertilize tomatoes. Okay, what would be happening there? Okay, I have a row of tomatoes, and half of it I give fertilizer and half of it I don't. I need an LI, fertilizing. Okay, half of it gets fertilizer and half of it doesn't. Okay, so what am I looking for? I'm hoping that if I give some of these tomatoes fertilizer that they'll grow bigger and stronger, and maybe they're more bug resistant and things like that. So I'm looking for positive outcomes with these tomatoes that have the fertilizer versus the ones that don't. So that leads me to the next point of this particular type. In an experimental, you have two groups. In experimental. Okay. One is the treatment group, and that's the one that I'm actually doing something to it, okay? So they get the intervention is what we say. Get the intervention. So in other words, if I'm working on antidepressant medicine with young kids, then the kids that are in my treatment group are the kids who are going to get the antidepressant medicines. So they get the intervention. We are hoping to change their outcome. So in this case, I would hope that kids who are on my particular antidepressant medicine that I'm trying to market, that fewer of them have episodes of depression, right? That's what I would hope for. Okay, so that's one group, treatment group. And the other group, you've probably heard of it before, is called a control group. Okay, and this is the one that gets the, what we call placebo, or sugar pill, or some other something that would basically not affect their outcome. Okay, so something that is unlikely to alter the subject's state. So, for instance, in the polio vaccination study, the control group probably got a shot of saline water, basically, right? Because you can give saline, a shot of that to a person, and it's not going to do much to them. So, if we were doing antidepressant medicines and people were taking a pill in the treatment group, antidepressant medicine in the treatment group, then in the control group we would just give them a little sugar pill or something else that's unlikely to cause any kind of change to that person's mental state, because we're looking for antidepressants, right? Okay, so these two groups show up in experiments, and we see them a lot. A lot of the medical stuff that goes on, we'll see these two different groups going on. So we need to know what those are. We need to know what a placebo is. Okay, that's basically the sugar pill, or it's the thing we give people that is not the medicine. Okay, it's not the intervention. It should not have any changes, make any changes happen. So that's what's going on with that. Okay. In addition, we have a couple of other things that are going on inside of these studies. So like for the observational studies, let me come back up here. There are some studies that are observational that are longevity studies. Longitudinal studies. Okay, what does that mean? Okay, long. They're really long, so it's not something that we're going to study for 6 months and be done. Okay, these would be years and years and years. One of the studies that I've seen in a couple of books was the effects of smoking on nurses long term. Okay. And this particular study is a 40-plus year study. They started it in the 70s sometime, okay? So it's been going for a long time, and so they look at nurses and they say, hey, you know, what are the side effects of that? How is your lifestyle? How do you end up at the end of your life? How are you in the middle of your life? And they watch lots of stuff that's going on, and they take up lots of data with these nurses. Now, they're not trying to get them to stop smoking, okay? In fact, they've got probably a group of people who smokes and are nurses, and a group of people who don't smoke and are nurses. So in that case, the treatment would be the fact that you're smoking, okay? But we're not looking at changing them. Okay, we're not trying to change them. We want to observe them and see what's happening there. So normally that's an observational study, and it's something, if we're talking longitudinal, it would last a long time. Okay. Then there's other stuff. So one could be a retrospective. Can't talk today. Retrospective study. Okay, think retro, which is like Throwback Thursday or something like that. For a retrospective study, this is one that's based on past data. Okay, so again, maybe I'm going through data and I'm looking at how many car crashes happened where people weren't wearing their seatbelts and what were the outcomes. Okay, now ethically speaking, I am unable to go say, hey, you guys, go crash your car and don't wear a seatbelt, right? We know that that's probably not going to do good stuff with them. But if we wanted to look at the data on what happens when people crash a car and they aren't wearing a seatbelt, then there's lots of data at different police departments and the DPS and different areas where I can go and I can just grab that data. It's already there, right? So this is past data, retro. And again, if it's already happened in the past, Can I change it? No, I'm not changing it. I'm just observing it. Okay. And then one more, and that one would be called a prospective study or a prospect. If you have prospects, that's future tense, right? Okay. What's happening in the future? So for this, maybe I start gathering data now, and I say, I'm going to go for the next 3 years, and I'm going to gather data all the car crashes where people aren't wearing seatbelts. Okay? I'm still not trying to affect anything or to cause anything to happen or to change any outcomes. I'm not altering anything as I go along. That would be experimenting. Okay, instead, I'm looking at this data and I'm saying I'm just going to go and gather data on how many people are in car crashes and didn't wear their seatbelt from now until the next 3 years. Okay, so that's a future or a prospective study. So that's what's going on there. Okay. All right, those are kind of the basics of what's going on. There are also a couple of different kinds of variables that we might be interested in. Variables. Okay, this is where the math starts coming in. Okay, variables we know are things that are unknown, right? And if you took an algebra class, you probably had some x's and some y's, and we called those variables. Well, in our case, in the statistics case, we are going to have variables. We're going to have things that are unknown, but they're not going to be x's and y's, for instance. Okay, so in other words, let's get a new scenario. Tutoring. Okay, let's say that I want to offer after-school tutoring to all the people who are maybe in need of help in their math class. Okay, and I'm going to tell them, okay, for the next 6 weeks we're going to come in and we're going to study all of our whatever you're working on, geometry, pre-calculus, whatever it is. Okay, we're sticking with math in this case. Okay, so we're going to do after-school tutoring. What do you think my goal is here? After-school tutoring. I'm hearing in my head, in Webster brain I hear, hopefully we'll raise their grades, right? And if we can do that, then the hope is that we will be able to say, if we set this study up correctly, which there's a lot of little variables we're going to have to deal with, but if we set this study up correctly, then hopefully we can say at one point that the tutoring helped increase students' grades in their math classes, right? So we got two different things going on here in this case. One is tutoring. Okay, and one is student grades in the class. Okay, these are both variables. They're unknowns. They're things that can change. They can go up and down. That's what variable means. It can vary, right? So you could have an A in that class or you could have an F in that class. You could get 10 hours of tutoring every week or you could get 0 hours of tutoring every week. So depending on, we hope, if you get more tutoring, if you're not doing well in your math class, we would hope that if you get more tutoring, that we would be able to raise your grade. So as tutoring goes up, hopefully the student grade goes up. And that's something we're going to talk about later, corresponding between the two of them. But that's what we would hope for, right? So there's two different kinds of variables. One variable is the variable of interest, okay, and, well, there's more than two, I'm sorry. In this particular case, there's two different kinds. One's the variable of interest, and one is the variable of response, okay. So what I'm interested in is I'm interested in whether or not this will help. Right? So it's the variable of interest. And the grade, whether or not it goes up and down, is what we would call respond. We think this variable responds, hopefully in a positive way, to the amount of tutoring. That's what we hope is going on here, right? Okay. That's what we would like to see. However, there's a couple of, so that's the response variable. This is the variable of interest. So, but there's a couple of other things that might be happening in here that, oh, maybe we need to take them into account. For instance, what if, I don't know, what if some student was getting outside help? Okay. What if their older brother is a math tutor or something like that? If they're getting some outside help, then that might actually give them positive results here, even though they're not attending our tutoring session, right? So it might mess us up, so to speak. We might have to worry about that. So in this case, what we say is this is a confounding variable. And a confounding variable is just something that might affect my outcomes, but it's not necessarily known to the person who's doing the study. Okay, so let's say things that might alter the outcome of the study without me, the researcher, knowing. Okay, so let's think about, and of course this is on an experimental thing, right? So tutoring for after school students, that's totally experimenting, right? We're trying to improve something, we're trying to affect change. So whenever we're trying to make something happen, that is totally going to be a treatment group and a control group, and that is not observational anymore, right? I'm totally trying to make something happen here. I'm trying to alter the outcome. Okay, so let's talk about the tomato study. If I have fertilizer, and I have, let's just say, size of tomatoes, and I can measure them, I can weigh them, I can take a ruler and see how wide and how tall and stuff like that. So fertilizer would be the influencer here, right? Okay, so it could explain, let's put it that way, it could be the explanatory variable. Actually, I think I should put explanatory up here for this one too. Explanatory. Tutoring is explanatory. Okay. So it could explain whether or not that tomato, if I have fertilizer, that could explain whether or not that tomato is bigger than the other tomatoes that I harvested, right? Okay, whereas the size of the tomatoes, that's the result, okay? That's the response variable. Now, something that I may or may not know about that could totally mess up my study, what about bugs? Bugs in the field. Okay, if the bugs go and they totally attack the tomatoes that I have fertilized, then I'm not going to get any good tomatoes out of that particular crop, right? Even though I watered them and I fertilized them and I took good care of them and whatever, this could really mess up my study. Could influence the outcome of my study, even though I wasn't planning for that necessarily. If I did a really good job of planning my study, then one of the things that I would think about in advance is, well, what will I do if there are bugs in my fields? Okay, probably those bugs will attack both fertilized and not fertilized tomatoes. So one of the things that I might put in place that I could hold constant that way is I might say, well, over here is my treatment group that's getting the fertilizer. They're getting this insecticide. Over here is my control group not getting any fertilizer, but they also get insecticide. Okay, that way I could say, oh, the bugs are equally taken care of in both groups as long as I apply it regularly the same way in both groups. Then the bugs would not necessarily be a factor, and maybe I could control for those and say, okay, let's not worry about bugs because I've got insecticide going, so hopefully that's not an issue. Okay, so that's kind of one of the things you got to think about when you're planning your study is, oh my goodness, what am I going to do if X, Y, and Z happen? Well, if those things happen, then maybe I need to think about how to mitigate the response there, how to make it so it's not quite such a big deal that those things happened. Okay, I have a couple of studies. So let's see what we think about this. Let's talk about let's do the Mozart one. This one's great. A study divided college students into two groups. One group listened to Mozart or other classical music after being assigned a specific task, and the other group simply was assigned the task without listening to the music. So here we go. Assign a task. With Mozart, and then the other group was just assigned a task. Okay, group 1 and group 2. So we take our sample, we split them up, we have a group that's going to be listening to Mozart while they're assigned a task, and we have a group that's not going to be listening to Mozart. No music for you. Okay, researchers found that those listening to the classical music performed the task slightly better, but only if they did the task within a few minutes of listening to the music. The two groups performed equally well on the tasks completed at a later time. Okay, and what they want us to do is identify the treatment and the control group. So which one's which? Oh, and what's the treatment? Okay, so here's my treatment group, right? This is the group that's getting an intervention that the other group's not, right? Okay. This group down here, they don't know that they were supposed to be listening to Mozart. For all they know, the task could be their whatever treatment is, their medicine, so to speak. So this is my control group. You do this without the intervention. So what is the intervention or the treatment? And the answer is listening to Mozart, right? So again, on the homeworks for this section, a lot of times you're going to have to look through it and sort through and say, hey, in that scenario, what's this? What's the treatment group? What's the control group? What am I trying to happen? So what do you think they are trying to happen? What's their goal for this study? Well, it sounds like their goal is to make people perform the task better, right? And I don't know what the task is. Maybe it's solving a puzzle or something like that. Rubik's Cube, who knows? But the fact is that they said that when they had these people do this task, the group that was listening to Mozart actually did better on the task. Immediately, not long term, but immediately. Okay, here's another one. You want to know whether teens who try marijuana are more or less likely to abuse hard drugs as adults. What type of study should you do? Does using marijuana as a teen make you more or less likely to abuse drugs as an adult? And actually, they're as an adult. There are a lot of studies out on this one, and I believe that the answer is it makes you more likely to abuse drugs. So stay away from drugs. Okay, so the question is, what type of study should you do? Well, again, is it okay for me to go out and gather up 100 teenagers and say, here, smoke some drugs or smoke some marijuana, and I'll come back in 10 years when you're an adult and I'll see if you have a drug addiction? No, that's not ethical, right? So anytime you start thinking, oh man, if I did an experiment with that, I could put people in danger, whether it's physical danger or mental danger, anything that could harm them. Anytime you start thinking about that, then I'm not going to do that experiment. And actually later we'll talk about that, the ethics of doing statistical data and research. And there is a lot that's based on, or a lot of information out there for what we can do and what we can't do ethically speaking, and there are a lot of organizations that keep us in line. And a lot of that goes back to World War II with the Nazis. So you'll end up seeing that as you go through this class that, hey, there's stuff I just can't do, and this is one of them. I cannot do an experiment on this. I would be kicked out of every research organization possible, and I would not be allowed to do this study. So instead, what do we do if we want to know the answers to this question? Because there are studies that have done this, but they didn't go out and try to get people who were teenagers to smoke marijuana. Okay? What do we think? We can't experiment, so instead we're going to do observational study, right? And we could do a prospective study, like starting now going forward for the next 10 years, but that's really hard to do because, well, quite frankly, I don't have 10 years to waste just gathering data, right? So a lot of people wouldn't do it that way. Instead, they'd say, okay, let's go back and look at data that already exists. So a lot of times some studies like this would be retrospective. Okay, let's go back to, I don't know, 1990 and look at teenagers then who smoked marijuana, and then let's compare them to those kids as adults in 2000, maybe 2010, maybe 2020. We could actually gather a lot of data on those kids now that they're adults if we can just find the records, right? So it might make sense to go back and say, hey, what kids do we know were doing drugs in the 90s or in 2000, that kind of thing. Okay, the book that I'm looking at says an observational retrospective study is really your only option in this case. You would collect data to determine whether adults who abuse drugs are more or less likely to have tried marijuana as teenagers than adults who do not abuse drugs. Okay, it would be highly unethical to conduct any experiment in which some of the participants are given this kind of drug. So, there you go. Yay. That's exactly what we said. Okay, there are a couple of little weird experiments that are, not experiments, effects that happen. So we need to address a couple of things. Oh, let me give one more definition here for a meta-analysis. It's a weird kind of study. Okay, a meta-analysis. Okay, a meta-analysis, sometimes you don't have to do all the research yourself. Okay. Sometimes what I'll do is I'll go back and I'll research studies that have already been done. Okay, so a meta-analysis is a study of research done in the past. Now it could be last year. It doesn't matter how far in the past. It's just a study that's already done that I don't have to do. So basically you put together findings from several different studies, as many as you can find on your topic. Okay, so for instance, if one person said, hey, I looked into tutoring after school and I see that it has positive results, and then somebody else says the same thing, and especially if I can get studies that were similar in the way they were set up, maybe if they were both 6-week programs or something like that, then I could look at them, and maybe it would help if I could get them from different geographic areas. So maybe one study is from the University of Chicago, while another is from Texas A&M College Station, and yet a third one is from University of Florida. Then I can, and they all say the same thing, then I can pull the results from different studies, and I can combine them, and I can basically write a paper that says, this study says blah, and this other study agrees, but this other study disagrees or agrees. I'm just going to say says blah. Okay, so when you say things like that, it's nice because you're not having to do any of the research yourself. The downside of it is that you're stuck with any flaws that they had. Okay, so for instance, what if the study from the University of Florida doesn't take into consideration the fact that so-and-so's older brother was a math tutor, okay, and that they got help outside of whatever we were doing? Well, then that's going to alter my results, right? Okay, or alter the results of that study from Florida. And if they didn't take it into consideration, then I'm just stuck with their results, right? There's not really a lot I can do about that, because that's what they're doing. It's not, I can't go back in time in their study and change that. Okay, that's what they've already done. So it's not my issue, basically. All right, so it's nice not to have to do a lot of study, a lot of research yourself, but you might not be able to find a lot of people who have done a lot of studies on your topic, whatever your topic is. So you might not have a bunch of people who will say, oh, I did this or I did that, and we looked at tutoring and we found this. I might not be able to do a meta-analysis, so you got to take that into consideration also. Okay, I started to say there's some effects. So one of the effects that you might have is an experimenter effect. Okay, so what's an experimenter effect? Okay, if I am going in to talk to kids who have been taking this antidepressant drug, and I'm the researcher, and I walk into the room and I say, you feel better, don't you? And I shake my head yes and no, then what's probably going to happen in that room? Well, probably whatever kid is sitting in the room with me is going to mimic me, and their head will go yes up and down, and they'll say, yeah, I feel better. Okay, so I could unduly, this is when the researcher unduly influences an outcome in a study. Okay, or if I know that this kid took the placebo, and so they shouldn't feel better, and I walk into the room and I go, oh, you still feel bad, don't you? And I shake my head side to side. Then maybe they'll, oh, yeah, I do kind of feel bad. You know, I'm kind of sad or this or that. So I can influence some of the outcomes there. So I need to watch out for that. Okay, so here's what happens. And one of the ways that we can try to avoid experimenter effect, me influencing them, even if I didn't mean to, I could still do it. One of the ways that we can do that is by blinding. Blinding a study is when we remove the researcher from access to the data. We'll say raw data. Such as which participants got a treatment, or did not. Okay, so what does that mean if I go in to interview a bunch of kids and I'm looking at this one kid and I don't know if they took the placebo or if they took the treatment? Well, chances are that I won't subconsciously or intentionally give body language that says, oh, you feel better, or you don't feel better, because I don't know. I don't know whether they should or should not feel better, okay? At the same time, there's other kinds of blinding that goes on. For instance, what if I'm giving people, I don't know, let's stick with the antidepressant thing. If I'm giving people the antidepressant and the participant goes, oh, I feel better because I gave them a pill, okay? Sometimes there's something called the placebo effect. Okay. Okay. The placebo effect is when a participant takes a placebo, whatever it is, and thinks they got the treatment, so they immediately, or upon their responses to the researcher, they really do think they have been altered. Normally that's in a better state, right? So if it was antidepressant medicine that we're supposed to be testing, then I give them the placebo, but they're like, oh, I got the medicine, I feel better. Oh, I'm less stressed, or I'm less this or whatever. So it's not necessarily that they're lying, it's just a subconscious thing, a mental thing. They think they got the meds and their mind says, oh, you feel better, good, okay? So in order to keep these types of effects from happening, there's a couple of different kind of blinding, okay? So one of the blindings is called single blinding. Okay, so single blinding, of course, means what? Only one of you is blinded, right? So the researcher knows who got the treatment, but the person in the study does not. Okay. Now, in something like the antidepressant medicines or the polio vaccination or something like that, it's pretty easy for the researcher to know and the person who got the medicine not to know. And it may not matter whether or not the researcher knows, because, you know, you either have polio or you don't. It's not like you can fake that, and it's not like the researcher, can influence whether or not you have polio. I gave you a shot. You either got the treatment or you got the placebo, and here are your results. And so it's not necessary all the time for the researcher to not know, okay? But in something like the antidepressant thing, where I could alter the outcome by giving hints or physically nodding or whatever, then sometimes we might not want even the researcher to know, right? In that case, it's called double blinding. Okay, single means one person knows, one doesn't. Double means neither one of them know. Okay, both the researcher and the participant are in the dark as to whether or not the participant received the treatment. Okay, so how does that happen? Okay, well, basically, if I was running a study on antidepressant medicines or whatever, then I would have to have a third-party person available who would take the data, figure out which of my subjects gets the antidepressant, which is going to get the placebo, and that person would have to say, okay, nurse or whoever, you administer these medicines, and then they would keep the records, okay? That person, that third-party person, would be like the only person who knows whether you got the treatment or not. And they would normally code the data. They might call people subject 1, subject 2, subject 3, and then I would have no way of knowing what they are, and so who got it, who didn't get it, and so it would just be subject 3 got the treatment. Okay, well, once I got back the results, I'd have to give that third party my results, and then they would put it according to which person had the treatment or not. So they have to be honest and ethical and all that, and we go from there. So that person is very vital if I have to do double blinding. But then there's sometimes that we don't need any blinding at all. Okay. So, for instance, if I'm doing the tomato thing, the fertilizer, then nobody needs to be blinded, right? There's no way I can affect their outcome. It's a tomato plant, right? So no blinding necessary. Everyone knows where the treatment was and where the treatment wasn't. In fact, in my fertilizer, in my crops, I might even plant signs, put out signs that says, okay, these over here, they got the fertilizer, and these over here, they did not get the fertilizer. So blinding can be very useful, but it's not always necessary, and it's not always necessary to blind everybody, so we got to watch out for that, okay? So how do you know your study has been successful? Well, eventually, hopefully, we like to replicate our studies. Okay, replicate, reproduce, do it again, okay? That's what we're talking about here. So, in other words, if I have a really great study about tutoring, and I want to make sure that it's not biased, we had that word last week, it's not being influenced unduly, then I would for sure want somebody else to do the study, or maybe I'd do the same study personally, but I'd do it in another area so that I wouldn't have issues. So you got to think about that, and eventually in academia, any kind of replicating that happens is going to have to stand up to peer review, which is when other people in your position go in and say, hey, you didn't account for this, or oh, you did a great job with that. But they're going to look at your study and they're going to say, oh, you didn't deal with this confounding variable. Maybe that's something that you got to worry about. So here's an example of a confounding variable that you might see at some point. So there was a group of people in a study with lung cancer. And this group had not smoked, and they hadn't been around smokers, so no secondhand smokers either. Okay, but yet they came up with lung cancer. They hadn't been in any areas with asbestos or anything like that. So, but they all came from a similar neighborhood, a similar region of the country. They were in Colorado, and when it came down to it, the researchers were really just confused, again confounded, by what happened that we have this group of people with lung cancer and we don't have any contributing factors. We don't know why they have them. It doesn't make sense. But they all lived in Colorado. So there's this thing called radon. And basically it comes up from the ground and it can poison you. Okay, so, and what happened was, as they studied these people and they studied their areas that they lived in and they studied their homes and all this, they started seeing, oh, all of these people have radon. Okay, so there was a one factor, one variable that was out there that we didn't know about it when we did our study, basically. Confounding, confusing, something that doesn't make sense, that we have this group of people with lung cancer and they don't have any contributing factors, until we find this one thing that's a variable we had no way of knowing about it, that they were having radon seep in through the ground into their homes and it was poisoning them. But it's this other variable we didn't know about. Okay. So depending on where you are and what you're doing, there could be things that come in that would make it so that the study that you're trying to do won't be quite as applicable. It's not replicatable as much in different areas. So you have to watch out for that. Okay, real quickly, in your book, in your homework, there are some things called, what's wrong with this study? Okay. So I want to make sure that we do one or two of those just so that you've seen some examples of them and you're ready to go. So what's wrong with this study? Let's see. We'll do some more later. Okay, so here's an example. Number 1, a new drug for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, is supposed to make affected children more polite. Okay, so it's an ADHD drug. Okay. Randomly selected children suffering from ADHD are divided into treatment and control groups. Okay, so far sounds good. My sample comes from kids who have ADHD. I've got 2 different groups of them. One's going to get a treatment, which is going to be my drug, right? The drug is going to be the treatment. And the other group is going to get a placebo. That's what control means. Okay? The experiment is single blind. What does that mean? That means that the researcher knows who gets the drug, but the participants don't know. Okay? And then we say experimenters evaluate how polite the children are during one-on-one interviews. Okay, so what's wrong with the study? Okay, and in Webster Brain, I hope you're saying there's a problem with the one-on-one interviews with researchers who know who got the drug. Okay, that's a problem, right? Because I know which kids I think should be more polite and which kids I think should still be suffering from issues with their ADHD. So I know, so it's bad for me to have that, right? Okay, here we go. Researchers, here's another one. We'll just do one more and then we'll be done. Researchers wonder whether drinking coffee before an exam improves performance. 50 coffee drinkers are told not to drink coffee in the 4 hours before an exam. Uh-oh. 50 coffee drinkers. No coffee right before an exam. And 50 non-coffee drinkers are told to drink coffee, at least 2 cups of coffee, in the 4 hours before they take a test. Okay. Both groups had the same average performance on the exam. Whew. That's asking for problems. Okay, so first of all, so what's wrong with this study? That's the question. First of all, do we have a treatment in a control group? Not really, right? So what we're saying here is that we're going to take these coffee drinkers and take them out of their norm, right? Make them not drink coffee. And we're going to take these non-coffee drinkers and push them out of their norm so that they're having to drink coffee, okay? If you're a coffee drinker and you're deprived of your coffee, then that's probably not a good thing, okay? And if you're not a coffee drinker and suddenly I push a lot of caffeine on you, then that's probably not a good thing. So the fact that they scored about average is actually probably about right because the averages were the same because they're both in a bad situation. That's not what a treatment group is in a control group, right? So think about that for a second. Yeah, we've got some other variables coming in, don't we? So what's going on here? Well, maybe some of these coffee drinkers are going through withdrawals, right? And maybe some of these non-coffee drinkers are going into caffeine overload. So those are some confounding variables that we've stuck in there. So what I'd like to think about is what would we do here? So like in the ADHD drug, that one's pretty easy for us to fix, right? Just double blind. Okay, or if you can't double blind, then we can have a third party do the interviews, right? So there's things I can do there. What about this though? This is just a bad setup for my study. So it doesn't make sense. This isn't a treatment and a control. What you would do is, you might even have 4 groups, right? So you might have coffee drinkers, if you wanted to compare. And some would drink coffee, and some would not have coffee, right? Okay, if that's so, if you're a coffee drinker and you have no coffee all of a sudden, then again, you might be going through withdrawals, but at least inside of this group, we're looking at the same people, basically. You all would have issues, right? So you all have coffee drinkers. You all want your coffee, but we could still have withdrawal issues, right? So it's kind of hard to design this particular study and not have problems because what happens over here? Non-coffee drinkers. If I look at this group separately, well, I would need a group that drinks coffee. And I'd need a group that has no coffee. Well, the problem with that is, well, these guys who aren't drinking coffee, that's just normal for them. They're taking a test like they normally would, right? But these who aren't used to drinking coffee and I put 2 cups of coffee into them, now they're hyped up, right? So it's very difficult to even design this study to begin with. So there you go. All right, one more. A chiropractor performs adjustments on 25 students with patients with back problems. Afterwards, 18 of the patients say they feel better. That chiropractor concludes that the adjustments are an effective treatment. Well, 18 out of 25. What's wrong with it? There's no control group, right? All 25 of them got adjustment. Okay, so if you want to do adjustments, then you'd have to say, okay, these 25 got adjusted, these 25 didn't, and then go back a couple of days later and say which ones of you feel better, which ones of you don't. So that's the way to do that. Okay, so there's a lot of stuff going on, like vocabulary-wise and all that, but hopefully you're seeing the different types of things that can happen inside of studies and observational versus experimental and getting some of that vocabulary down. Okay? All right, I'll get these videos posted and we'll talk to you later. Thanks.